Did you ever envision that you would turn your life around like this?
I was once a good drug dealer. I was once a good criminal. But now I can be a really good person in this field, and that's what really inspired me to transform the skills into a different set of kind of work areas. When I say that, I still feel a bit weird, I'm thinking academic, I'm an ex-criminal, I'm not an academic, but I am. That's what I've become. Kumanjayi Walker had been shot.
Going into the community 2 days after that shooting, it was volatile. Going in there, how did it feel? What could you feel the tension in the community?
I had to actually go, how am I going to move in this space? I don't want to make a mistake, even though I am a black fella.
Yeah.
I can still make mistakes. The Coniston massacre happened 100 or so years ago. A bunch of police officers coming on horseback and shot a lot of people. They rode through and they shot women, children and men. That shooting at that time of Kumanjayi, when we went out on country, it was lingering, but the pain of Coniston massacre matched and linked to that event.
Okay.
Because they were very similar. At that moment, what was named is that they've only just begun again. And the fear within the young men at that time, they were quite worried to actually walk around the community because they weren't sure if they were actually next. And then for the old men that held the stories of Coniston, the fear was very real because they've heard the stories directly from the family members that were actually linked to Coniston. And at that time, I remember that the community had said to the police, if you want to come and speak to us, you put your guns up. I know even me as an outsider, there wasn't a trust there.
The I Catch Killers podcast was a fresh start for me, as I left policing behind and started a new life. Over the years, we've laughed together, cried and shared some powerful moments. Welcome to I Catch Killers. Welcome back to part 2 of my chat with Lukas Williams. In part 1, we learnt about Lukas' rough upbringing and that led to substance abuse, crime and lengthy terms in prison. Sadly, that's a path that's followed too many times by young people, and particularly young Indigenous men. In part 2, we're going to talk about what Lukas is doing now to break the cycle. Lukas, welcome back.
Thanks, Gary.
Well, we gave you all the heavy stuff in part 1 and dissected your life, and thanks for being so open and honest with it about what's happened. I want to just read out a quote. I was doing the research for the podcast and looking at things you had said and done and been quoted on. I'll just read this quote out. The work that I do aims to put an end to racism in Australia and puts emphasis on healing. If we do not heal, then the past simply repeats itself and the next generation is stuck in another cycle of trauma. Breaking the cycle takes work. Healing takes time and effort, and I want to be there, to be a guide and a mentor to those who need a helping hand. After all, I was in the same boat 12 years ago, so I understand the real lived experiences that people had suffered. They're pretty lofty goals, and that's a pretty tough task. Is this the type of thing that you're doing now? Is this what you want to achieve with the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, look, it definitely is the work I want to achieve, and it is the work I'm doing now. I would like to see a country where we have all cultures come together, no matter the story and the history. But to do that, we have to really sit in the depth of some of the storytelling and the history so healing can take place.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer that healing can't take place unless an individual has an opportunity to tell the story. And for First Nations people, in this particular instance with that quote, I think we need to have a space where the real deep stories come out. And what I see is that people don't want to hear those stories because they're quite deep and they're painful. But if we can create a society that can actually create safety to hear those stories, we're going to see healing on great deep levels. And that's my mission, is to do those things for all people. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a very worthwhile mission, and I know it's not just words. You're actually doing stuff to achieve what you're setting out to achieve. So let's talk about your release from prison. You had your 6 years, you went out, ended up back in 18 months, and you've come out. Talk us about who you were at that particular point in time.
When I got out of jail, I was a person that I didn't know where I was going. And again, I hit a bit of a spiral for, a year or two on the drugs and alcohol. And then some not so good things happened around me. Some people were murdered and different things like that. And I switched. I changed. And at that moment, I was taken in by my mother.
And this was when? Sorry, 2000.
So December 2011.
Okay, and you were how old roughly?
28.
Okay,
28.
Yep.
So I was 28 years old. I just spent basically from the age of 12 through to 28 in chaos, and it was not long after that. It was in January 2012 that my mother said, I want to take you into Ballina TAFE in New South Wales and enrol you into a Cert 4 in drug and alcohol.
Yep.
See, my mother was one of the first Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ladies in Australia to do a Cert 4 that was ever introduced to Australia back, in the 97s or whatever. So she wanted me to follow that path. So in she goes, she takes me into Ballina TAFE, and I signed into a Cert 4. And so that was the first introduction basically to education, really, despite the ones that I had been through in jail. It was the first introduction into an academic world that I knew nothing about. So much that I actually failed my first assessment because I plagiarised. Yeah. I copied people's work. I didn't know what it was about.
It would have been intimidating, confusing, and source your quotes and do this. What's this all about? It's a completely foreign world to you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It was. The teachers. I'm hearing teachers talk about things from an academic lens that I had no idea about. I couldn't write 100 words, and so I was very vulnerable because I had to. It was also a course where it was academic, but yet it was telling your story also. And so this was, some of the first times that I ever told stories, and I'm in a classroom of 30. Yeah. And I've always been quite truthful and open about my story because I feel like that's the way to heal. But here I am telling stories that made people kind of jaws hit the ground because they didn't know how to deal with it in the room. And that's kind of what also made me think, I want to start to learn how we create safe places so everybody in the room can actually hear stories. Okay. How they can share their stories when they hear stories.
So these are people that hadn't experienced the world you've experienced, and you're telling your story, and it's almost too confronting, and that's right. They're looking at you differently, and yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And these are people, and look, I hold great respect for those people, but these are people that's going into the industry to help people like me. It was only that I had lived experience in the room, and many people didn't. Not on the level that I probably did. They probably had lived experience in many other areas. Yeah. And I remember going through the journey when I tried to heal. The mental health services and the hospitals used to kind of send me out the door because they didn't know how to help me. And I want to make a difference in that space. Is that we need people that can actually hear the stories of deep trauma, and if we don't have those people, we're going to have a generation that repeats. That trauma outwards to society.
Okay, so you've enrolled, and how did that change? Was there a turning point where you started to feel comfortable and I can actually do this, or I'm getting where they're coming from?
Yeah, it was a lady by the name of Janice. She was one of my teachers, and a lady by the name of Sue, and they were my two first teachers. But I got a 90% in my first assessment. I failed the first one, but then when I went back and done it, I got 90%. That was the first assessment I ever passed in my life, out of primary school, high school. And so I didn't believe it to start with because I didn't think it was possible. But then I knew that I could do something different. And I went on and smashed that out. I've done it. Took me 12 months. I got all high kind of marks for all my assessments. Yeah. And one of the biggest ones that I was the highest in was actually communication, and I never knew that. And I thought I was a shit communicator.
Well, I'm sitting here, and you're a very good communicator. But it's funny, and your self-esteem must improve so much, like doing that. Okay, so I'm not worthless. I've got something to say and do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it was in that moment that people in the room that stayed on to do the course, as in other students. When I started to tell my story, they were really inspired. By 6 months into the course, they used to really love me kind of checking in mornings or, whenever it might be. Because I bring something new or a journey that I just moved through. And so, and then I started to learn not only am I good at some of the academic stuff, I'm also good at lived experience and sharing stories to help people with inspiration. And so I learned quite quick that I was once a good drug dealer, I was once a good criminal, but now I can be a really good person in this field, and that's what really inspired me to transform the skills into a different set of kind of work areas, which was the trauma-informed lens. Okay. And that's where I've used the not so good experiences from the old life and put it to practice in my healthy life.
Well, something's worked, and in 2018 you were awarded the Northern Territory's Government Aboriginal Services Remote Worker of the Year. Yeah. Tell us about that.
So I was... life went on. I went on to do diplomas, degrees, masters, now into a PhD. And in 2018, I got
Sorry, just break that down. So it's all a matter of fact, but you're saying the very first one that you enrolled in, you were so far out of your depth. What have you got now?
So I went from a Cert 4, I went
Yep.
into a double diploma.
Yep.
A year later, that was. Again, that was more academic, so it was more writing, more research. But again, I loved it. It was like a fix. You know, I was learning something deep for the body. So I achieved that. It was a journey, but I achieved it. And then I went to, after I finished that, I had never thought in a million years I would have a diploma. That was back in 2013. And then I went to Wollongong University and I done a degree in Indigenous Trauma and Recovery Practices. That was 2016. And then at that moment I thought, wow, there's just nowhere else I could go here. But then I went on to do a master's. I done a master's in Indigenous Health. And I finished that, got high marks, and then I was considered an academic then. And when I say that, I still feel a bit weird. You know, I'm thinking academic. I'm an ex-criminal. You know,
Yeah.
I'm not an academic, but I am. That's what I've become. So I'm quite proud to share that. You know, to share that I'm now an academic. And then I've gone on now to enter into a PhD. So I'm doing a PhD around healing, using traditional healing circles,
Right.
and how that improves the social and emotional well-being for First Nations people.
Okay.
But not only that, how we create a service where the nation has a tool to use with our people. So that's what it's all about.
Well, we'll break that down and delve into that. But I just want to ask a question that, your mum took you in December 2011.
Yep.
And she still had some trust in you.
Yep.
How proud was your mum and dad when you've got to this stage where you're graduating and master's degrees? And
Yeah, look, I'm the first family member in my family of, 600 just from my grandmother's line that's went on to do a master's and into a PhD. So no one's ever graduated in this space. So they're pretty proud. They're pretty proud to have, a son that they never thought would come out of the criminal world. And now they feel like it's part of their win. They're proud to talk about it.
Yeah.
So wherever they go, if my name gets mentioned, they're like, yeah, that's my son.
before there might have been shame.
They were shame.
Yeah.
I put them through a lot of shame when I was a young fella. And I didn't give a shit at the time, but I was very selfish. Where now they can be proud.
Did you have family at the graduation?
I actually didn't go to my graduation.
Yeah.
Because I was actually in community doing work.
At
the time, I thought that was more important.
Okay. That says a lot about the person you have become.
Yeah. It was more important. I was in community doing work around suicide.
Yeah.
Which is linked to the 2018 awards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So describe us white city dwellers down here when you talk going into a community in the Northern Territory. What are we looking at? What do people realise?
So we're going into a community where, firstly, language for local mob, well, English is like maybe sixth language. Mm. You're sitting with old people that I call going to community Bush University. Some of the old people that I've sat with out on community are some of the most smartest people I've ever sat with. And they come across to me like a professor in uni, So we're firstly, we've got to move in community in a way that's safe. But we're faced with trauma beyond our imagination, in my experience. And when we go in and we start to actually sit, like I said, if we create safe enough places, we're going to hear some of the stories. Example, Yundamu, in the Coniston massacres, when we went out to do the work out there, we went out onto country. Mm. We went back to the Coniston massacres and we sat down for days and told them stories. But these are the stories that I guess the rest of Australia, I think, as in like the cities, they may not know about. And it's not until you go and sit down and hear those stories that you get a grasp for the depth of trauma. And why maybe, that it might be so hard to live in remote because of those reasons. And why there's needed, there's more resources needed, there's more understanding needed, there's more trauma-informed skilled workers needed. It can be a hard journey if someone doesn't know how to navigate it.
Paint a picture of sitting down and telling stories. Like, describe that to us.
Sure. I might use Yundamu as a story.
Okay.
So at the time, and again, I just want to name that I got permission from the family to speak about this story. So at the time that Kumanjayi Walker had been shot, I got a phone call about 2 days later, and said, look, would you come out to Yuendamu, because no one was allowed to come and go at that time.
Yeah.
Luckily enough, I was known in other communities, and so they gave me a call to go out and sit with the community. So I went out into the community, and I took about 10 or 15 men out onto country, and this is, keeping in mind, just like a week or so just after the shooting. And when we sat down on country, we went out, and the first thing we started to talk about was obviously the shooting, and the amount of pain that come from that conversation was it went straight to the Coniston massacres, and the stories was so in depth. It was the fear that the men now in the community feared that they might be next in the firing line.
Okay.
And it was really weird. It was real.
Can you just link the massacres that you talk about, what the history of that is?
Sure.
So people understand?
Yep.
And how that history is carried through and followed up to that.
Yeah. And that's a good point, Gary, is the Coniston massacres, happened 100 or so years ago. And it was around, I won't share deeply about the story. It's not my story to share, but I'll share the knowledge that I have. And it was around, it was a bunch of police officers that come in on horseback and shot a lot of people out at Coniston massacre out at Coniston, which is 50k from Yuendamu. Basically Yuendamu, really. Yeah. And so they rode through and they shot, women, children and men. And so now we come to 2000, 2018, 19 at the time, and we go out on country and we start to talk about the shooting of Kumanjayi. That shooting at that time of Kumanjayi, when we went out on country, it was lingering, but the pain of Coniston massacre matched and linked to that event.
Okay. Because
they were very similar. Not only, did we think the shootings were finished, at that moment, what was named is that they've only just begun again. And the fear within the young men at that time, they were quite worried to actually walk around the community because they weren't sure if they were actually next. There was a deep fear there. And then for the old men that held the stories of Coniston, the fear was very real because they've heard the stories directly from the family members that were actually linked to Coniston. So it's not like it was, a million years old. This was very recent. It was near.
Yeah.
So, and you've got to hold those stories with great care, and you've got to listen deeply, and it's real. It's really real. And to sit with some of the young men and the uncles and hear those stories, I could see the realness and the pain that sat inside them. And then we had workshops where all the services would come together. And I remember in those workshops we had some, unfortunately, non-Indigenous workers, when you got a room full of 15 Yuendamu mob, say, why would you think that people are going to be shot in this community? And so the whole room would go silent, and I remember in that moment, the community just looked around and was like, well, actually, we've just had a young person shot in this community, and we're living on grounds or on country where the Coniston massacre took place. So we had to map through that to bring some understanding for some of the service providers individuals, I should say, that pushed back on some of that conversation.
So it's interesting talking about it because I do understand the world for a variety of reasons, but I also understand very much I'm a white man, and when I'm working in Indigenous communities, that I'm trying to be sensitive, but sometimes you come in there and it's clunk. You've just missed the point somewhere. And I know when I did work in the Bowraville community, elders would pull me aside. I got growled at big time when I first came in. You're a white man, you're a cop, why would we trust you? And that just, I had to learn. And I was fortunate that some of the elders pulled me aside and said, hey, just try it this way, and the difference it makes. But I think there's just that misunderstanding, and you would agree, I'm sure, that ignorance causes problems. If people are ignorant to things, that's where things break down.
Yeah, definitely. Look, I think you're spot on. And I also see it as a few different kind of scenarios. Like, you have people that may misunderstand, and there might be some ignorance, but they're willing to learn. And then you have people that come in that come with the same kind of understanding, misunderstanding, but yet there's this embedded racism that comes. So there's two different lenses. And when that other person comes in that has got that deep racism, we feel it.
Yep.
And we know actually this person is coming in with some deepness that doesn't fit this scene. And so it's not long before they've actually marched out of community. Compared to someone that might be non-Indigenous and comes in, may not be, fully accustomed to everything or might not understand everything, but they're willing to actually hear and listen and take on different stuff. And those are the people that make a big difference for First Nations mob, you know, that are willing to listen and hear and speak and, you know, and sit and listen to the elders and be directed that way.
I think some people come in with an unconscious bias, which is almost an ignorance, where they think they're saying the same thing or saying the right thing, but they're showing their biases and the way they're thinking by the comments that they're making. So it is a delicate area, but I'm interested in hearing it from a black fella side and saying from a white fella. Yeah. Sometimes it's scary. You go in there and you think, okay, I want to be appropriate. Yeah. I'll reference one point because I think this is interesting. I've probably talked about it before, but it was significant. With the Barrable community, when I first became friendly with or started working with them, they're like family now. I feel part of the mob. They said, why doesn't the Commissioner come up and apologise? 3 kids have been murdered, there'd been a failed investigation, all sorts of things that had occurred because of it. Why can't the boss man come over and say sorry? And Mr. Scipione was the commissioner at the time. I remember going to his office and he was getting advised by all the people around him, and he was listening and you could see him getting more and more confused, and it was becoming more and more complicated. And he basically said, Gary, what should I do when I go there, if I go there? And I said, go there and treat them like you'd treat your own family in those circumstances. And he ended up coming up and addressing the families and saying that, we're sorry, we got it wrong, we could have done it better. And it was so powerful to the community. Like they still haven't got justice and they're still fighting for justice, but just someone to come up there. And there were little things like he was going to land the police helicopter near the area where the meeting was, and we pointed out to him it mightn't be a good look when the big boss man comes down in the helicopter, so maybe park it there and drive in. And but I found that good that something like that happened. But it's all about this miscommunication and overcoming these, and that's why I'm really interested in the work that you're doing, that you're trying to break down those barriers. Going into the community 2 days after that shooting, it was volatile. It was made national news, and there was outrage, and there was a lot of things happening there. There was a lot of pressure. Going in there, how did it feel? What could you feel the tension in the community?
I could feel. I wouldn't say tension. I'd say the sadness. Okay. I never feel when I go into a community. Someone else might feel tension, but I definitely feel the depth of trauma in the community rather than the tension. Yeah. And that took me a couple of days to actually start to make sense of it. I knew that I'd stepped into Yuendumu and other places that I go, you know, and it's always quite vibrant and but this time I could feel the sadness. Sorrow. I knew that there was a lot of sorrow. Yeah. Obviously we knew, you know, it just been a shooting. But I had to actually go, how am I going to move in this space? You know, I don't want to make a mistake, even though I am a black fella. Yeah. I can still make mistakes. Yeah. So I had to be respectful, and and the first thing I could think about is I had to just move and just listen deeply. I had to practice everything that I'd been preaching to every other service that I work with. Yeah. I was the one that had to do this now. Yeah. And that's what I did for the last, you know, up until today even. I actually literally spoke with Kumanjayi's family 2 days ago to let them know I was coming on here to speak with you. Yeah. And they gave me their blessing to speak about different things. Okay, and that was out of respect. That was out of respect. Understanding, but because it's at the time we're recording this, the inquest is going, so it's very, it's a lot happening. But those little things, showing that respect makes a big difference. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. The relationship between police, and you can talk in a general sense, or you can talk that community, between police and Indigenous communities. How would you describe? You talking in general, or you talk? Let's talk that community first up, and then in general. Look, right now I'm not sure. Yep. And again, I wouldn't want to cross boundaries in trying to portray what I think. But I know at the time, you know, that was at the time that the shooting took place, and then at the time that the trial was on, I was contracted to go and sit with the community for that 6 weeks to sit with the community and do healing stuff. And at that time, I remember that the community had said to the police, if you want to come and speak to us, you put your guns up. And at that time, the police put their guns up and they left them in the station. Yeah. And they would come down and then they would have a meeting with the community and they would, whatever, you know, there'd be conversations, put it that way. And so at that time, there was a respect happening. But again, there was still, I know even me as an outsider, there wasn't a trust there. You know, I was like, not sure about what's happening here. Community has been hurt so much through this experience that how do you trust, or how are you sure with some of the stuff that's happening in Australia from a government perspective? How can you be sure that what the people that are showing up here are coming with true intent? That was my perspective. That doesn't mean that was the perspective of community, but I think that we all had that kind of feeling.
Yeah.
But again, there was a respect where the police would turn up and have conversations. And again, it's not my thing to talk about that. I don't want to disrespect community and pretend like I know what was going on there. That's probably more for community to speak about. But yeah, look, I do know that at the time some of the elders would say that, you know, there was some old police officers that come back to work in the community, and they respected them. They said that person's okay. You know, we're okay to have her here. I remember that there was a particular lady. So yeah.
It's interesting you talk about the community want certain police back. I know the Bowraville mob, one of the Lulu, she made a comment to me once.
Yep.
Because they rotate police through the stations, and invariably it's a 2-year tenure or 3-year tenure, and she goes, they send us here, these new guys, and it takes us 2 years to train them, and then they get rotated out. And I think, there's some really value if you line up police that match the community like, and if they can stay there forever, I don't think it's a bad thing.
No, for sure.
It's because I just think if people, it takes a while for everyone to learn their place and learn how to communicate, and so I can see some benefits there. I had Jaron Badgett, one of our early guests on the podcast, and we've become good friends. She was in the police. She grew up in Redfern in the block during the volatile times. And she joined the police because she wanted to make a difference, because she saw how her family were treated by police growing up in the block. She made the comment that how beneficial it would be if police the police that are working in country towns where you get some city cops coming up into a country town, if it's a high Indigenous population, let them go out on country for a week with the elders and just get a feel of what this is all about. And it wouldn't be a big impost on the police. Just say, okay, your first week there, you're going out on country for a week. What do you think of an idea like that?
Look, I think when you tell it that way, what I call and what Mob Out Central Way and Top End Way would say is that it's been done right way. It's been done in a way that's done in First Nations way, in mob way. And anyone that goes out into communities, there's so often, when I brung together the 57 communities in Yuendamu at that time, back in 2019, I think it was, we had a room of about 50 people, all service providers. And those service providers, there was half of those that didn't know each other. And they're working in a community for the last 18 months together, but yet they didn't know each other. And they didn't know some of the key elders. And so one of the things that I quite often talk about when we go into communities and remote communities is actually everybody that comes in the community need to do a cultural awareness introduction community way. And that means going out on country and learning some of the sacred spaces and spots of that community, the sacred stories, the history of the community, because there's much more likely to be an understanding of what's took place on them lands. But too often, that doesn't happen. But if it was to happen, there'd be a difference, I think.
I think there'd be, and I can look at it from a police officer's point of view, that it took me a long time to understand the Bowraville community, because they showed me the time, and they had the patience with me. But doing something like that, I think it would potentially break down barriers. I want to see the communication between different groups. So with that community. And we've gone a long way from talking about your award. Let's bring your award back. That's the type of work that you were doing when you got the award in 2018?
Well, that was one of them. This award here in 2018 was for another community. I got a phone call. There had been a couple suicides, and they'd asked if I'd come and work with the men in the community. This is one in a community in Central Australia. And I ended up staying there for 2 years. And we built one of the strongest men's groups in the territory. And, 60, 70 men would come along every fortnight. The first time I ever run it, there was one person that come in, it was a non-Indigenous teacher. And I thought to myself, oh my God, I ain't going to be able to pull this off. But 2 years later, it was one of the most powerful groups in the territory. And we really got to talk about the impacts of those suicides on the community, because we've seen a lot of copycatting happening after those two suicides. You had family members trying to take their lives, and there was times where I was showing up weekly around 1 or 2 potential suicide attempts. And so it was pretty scary for the first 12 months after those 2 suicides. And that's where the awards come from, from that community and that work. It was recognised, and I won those 2 awards. Yeah.
And the high rate of suicide in the communities is, it's well, I say shameful, it's just sad.
And I think it's very sad. It's very sad, and it's due to when you kind of mentioned there before, how would you explain on what happens when you go to community? And it's not until you go to community till you sit and you hear some of the experiences of trauma, and that I would kind of describe as that these are the reasons that some of these suicides are taking place, is because of some of that historical trauma, some of the intergenerational trauma that has never been addressed. And yet, when I come from the city perspective, or I see social media, it's always about black fellas this or Aboriginal people this, but there's actually a story behind some of that stuff. Let's listen to that, and we're going to make a difference. And so that's what I see playing out, is suicides and not so good behaviours due to the impact of trauma. And
you mentioned the copycat suicides, like when there's one in the community, invariably, it creates others going down the same path.
It definitely does, and I talk about this term that's called unfinished business, and what that means is, if you're a young person and you've maybe had the thought of suicide in your life, you might forget about it from 11 through to 21. And then at 21, you'll see somebody try to do suicide, or they might actually succeed in suicide. And then those young people that had that pain inside, that unfinished business, will be triggered, and then all of a sudden that's where the copycat will start to take place. And I see that quite often, in communities. And it's really sad. I think you named it very well. Spot on. It's sad.
Yeah. The men's group.
Yep.
Talk us through what you can tell us of. You get a men's group. So you said you met once a fortnight. What happens there, so people understand?
So look, firstly, what we do is we establish a safe place.
Yep.
And more times than not, when I go to a community, a lot of the service providers that fund me to come into the community, they might identify to have a men's group in the community.
Yeah.
And one of the first things that we identified together as men is we go, where is your safe place here? Like, where would you feel safe to meet and start to talk about these stories? And because one of my things is, I think that there's this terminology is that men don't talk about emotions. I like to flip that on the head, and I think it's not that. It's just there's not enough safe places. And so these men identify that usually their safe places are on country, usually on men's ceremony grounds. And so that's where we go back. We go back to that place that's safe. And more times than not, 100% of the time when we do this, we then start to identify some traditional ways of being, sitting in circle, and what's the elements to creating safety for men to actually talk about those stories. And that's where it begins. It begins by finding a safe place on country that the men know in the body is safe, because they know no one can go there.
Yeah.
And that's a safe place for them.
Okay, yeah. And that creates it.
That creates it.
Your business that you've set up, what's the situation there?
So I obviously developed so I've got a business. It's Lukas Williams Leadership Inside Out. Yep. And connected to that is also a business of mine, which is called Ghana Healing. Well, it's a model. Yep. Ghana Healing means deep listening, and it's become best practice in Australia. It services some of Australia's largest mental health services and government bodies and so on. And so it's a trauma-informed experiential program that can train up workforces from CEO down to your cleaner. It also, that's one component, but then there's also leadership stuff in there. There's cultural awareness stuff in there. There's also just me working with CEOs in, for example, there's a CEO at the moment in Australia, and I'm working with that CEO on how to actually move within remote communities. And it's going beautifully.
So this is the cultural awareness and competency that needs to. You can. I'll say a mining company. Only it's a mining company going into a community.
Yep.
What are the type of things? How have you got to approach the community?
Yeah, but the difference with what I do is so you got your cultural awareness training, where I actually come and I actually work with CEOs and different people more one-on-one.
Okay.
Rather, because anyone can go through a training.
Yeah.
But it's about being competent in the way that we move forward. And so I kind of work with people on, all right, how do we do this? You know, and then they'll bring me back stories that they're uncomfortable about, or they didn't work out, or they didn't this, or they didn't that. And we story map that on how to actually do things a little bit different.
Okay.
So that's the cultural competency stuff. Motivational speaking around my story. But the biggest component of what I do is the trauma-informed work in remote communities for men, women and communities. Also training up, like I said, service providers around trauma-informed skills on how to hear stories, understand stories. And the element to it is deep listening. You know, if we can listen deeply, a little bit like that Yindamu story I shared with you, when I went into that community, I didn't know what to do. But one of the things that I fell upon was going back to my own model, was deep listening and just being in the space and listening to the stories. And then when I enter that, I usually find the solution that I need to go upon. And so that's kind of the journey that we take people on. You know, it's an experiential journey.
Yeah,
yeah.
And there'd be a lot of demand for it, I would imagine.
There is. I'm booked out way in advance, and there is a lot of demand. And I wish there was more like it. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a question. It's because I'm genuinely curious that the referendum from last year, the result, that the no vote won out. But there was a lot of talk and there was a lot of confusion, like across the country, and you'd be thinking, you know, like in this area of Erskineville, it was definitely it was going to be the yes vote that we went for. So when the no vote came out, I was disappointed.
Yep.
Yeah. How did it feel in the communities? What was it? Because there seemed to be some division between. There's people I respected.
Yep.
That were saying no,
yep.
and there's people I respected that were saying yes.
Yep.
And I'm talking Indigenous people.
Yep.
Did it divide the Indigenous community, and what's your views on the whole thing?
I had the same experience. Like, obviously, I was a yes.
Yep.
I had, you know, sisters of mine, very close people that I was connected to that voted no. And what I did is I tried to stay out of the argument of it, although it was very hurtful.
Yeah.
And then I was travelling community at the time, and I remember every single elder or person I come up against was, not up against, that I actually connected with. They expressed the deep kind of pain of the no. And one of the most probably pivotal things that I'd heard was that an old man said to me, you know, I think we've just confirmed that Australia has identified and confirmed that we live in a racist country.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow. And I said, oh, tell me why, Uncle. And he goes, well, you know, majority of our people actually wanted the yes vote, and the way that he expresses it, and the way that I seen it, I think that was the case. And we've actually, unfortunately, there's been a decision made for us, but not from our own people. It's been from the majority of Australia. And that's the same, you know. Well, it's not the same. That's sad.
It is sad.
Because I would never want to make a decision for another culture that's not the same as my culture.
Yeah.
I would want them to make their own decision, what's right for them, and I want to support that. And so that's how I see it. You know, I think, you know, if there's a culture that's hurting, no matter what culture they come from, no matter what background they have, and they're saying that something needs to change for them, let's love them and support that, and let's just support that journey for them. And so I find it really hard to understand. I find it baffling to understand why, you know, why it was a no.
It was a sad day, I thought. And what worried me after it, and this is just from my own personal experience, I was doing a talk to a large crowd, and an acknowledgement from country, and people started booing and hissing, and you're thinking, this wouldn't have happened 3-4 weeks ago, but it was almost like, no, we're definitely for the no vote. It was almost making a statement. It wasn't everyone, it was just a small group, but I'm thinking that wouldn't occur, and I just hope it I hope it doesn't make things worse. But I thought it was a sad day.
Yeah, definitely. Look, and I actually done a keynote speech a couple of days after the no vote, and I was emotional. I delivered it in a way that was really good, but, you know, I felt the pain of it. It was really painful. And so I had to be off social media. I had to not be involved in, you know, because I noticed I was being asked questions about the yes or no vote, not purely to hear what I thought, but more so they could hear, so they could respond to me.
Yeah.
And I find that's not good behaviour.
No.
You know, like why would you want to do that to somebody?
Yeah, you're setting yourself up.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a shame. But I guess something that I'll take from this, and something I've also said in my keynotes, is that yes, it's a no, but I'm going to do everything in my power to continue to bring healing. So so that's still my mission, even though that's been an experience that's hurtful, same as the 67. But you know, well, actually not the same as the 67. My grandmother was part of the 67 referendum.
Yeah.
So it's that pain's in there, but I need to just continue to do the healing.
Did you ever in your wildest dreams think you'd be where you are now when you were angry young man? Even after they gave you 6 years, you decided to come out and settle some scores, and you had to go back in. Did you ever envision that you would turn your life around like this?
No, look, my vision was, there's a couple movies. There's one, The Postcard Bandit, and the other is Blow, and has Johnny Depp.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So my vision as a young fella is I wanted to become an armed robber like Postcard Bandit.
Yeah, great.
And I wanted
Abbott or something, I think. Yeah,
yeah, I'd done time with Abbott years ago.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to have the money that Johnny Depp had in that movie.
Yeah.
So that was I was like, I wanted to achieve that. And that's where I become, you know, a speed cook and blah, blah, blah. But I would never imagine that I would actually be on the other side of the fence, helping people. And looking back at that life and just thinking to myself, you know, even the language within the jail systems, all that, I don't use that anymore in my life today.
Yeah.
I don't want it to consist in my life that my kid's here, because I just see it as a load of shit. And so I would never see myself back in that world. And I always encourage the men that I sit with today is, you know, to transform the brain, we must transform everything.
Yeah.
And that means our language, the way we talk about jail, because that's not part of who I am anymore.
Yeah.
My story is a different story. And I want the people in my life my kids to grow up with that. I don't want them to grow up with the language of jail.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, listening to your talk, I can see why you're doing a lot of keynotes. That's someone they were right way back in the early days when they said you got good communication skills.
Yeah.
So you've definitely moved from that life. But there's so much to be learnt from that. Yeah, your lived experiences, and it carries weight in what you're doing, and it's made you the person you are today.
And it does. And look, I remember this one police officer. I haven't heard of his name for a long time. His name was Aaron O'Sullivan. And he was a police officer, a detective in New South Wales. And I remember he was one of the police officers that used to say to me, Luke, you're going to make it somewhere in life one day. This is a 13-year-old boy. And he was one of them cops that used to say, you know what, mate, I've got you. You can lie or want, but I've got you. And I used to just go, yeah, you got me.
Yeah.
And I always remember him saying that to me, and I always believed it.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, I'm going to do something different in my life, and here I am today.
Well, it shows how important when you're in those low points that you were in your life. If one person shows you some respect or gives you some encouragement, the difference it can make.
Oh, it's major.
Yeah,
it's major. Yeah.
Well, I think this is about time that we wrap it up. I just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure sitting down and having a chat with you.
Yep.
And if you ever reflect and laying there reflecting that you're balancing the ledger, I get back to what with the introduction that you decided you wanted to make a difference, you wanted to heal, and you wanted to heal others, and you're actually doing all those things.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I hope to think I am. Doing those things. I want to do everything in my power to make sure that I do those things for people in my life.
Yeah. Well, you're working in a tough area, a difficult area, an emotional area, sad. It's got all the emotions there, and you're hanging in and you are making a difference. So congratulations, and thanks for coming on I Catch Killers.
Yeah. Thanks, Gary. Thanks for having me. Cheers.
Well, we've done a lot of stories of redemption, and he's right up there. His life was at a pretty low place when he was in prison, but look at the work he's doing now. I'm very familiar with the type of work Lukas is doing in remote communities, and it's a tough gig, and I think quite inspiring. Not only has he healed himself, he's now trying to heal others, and it is important to bridge that gap between Indigenous communities and the white communities and bring everyone together. And people like the work that Lukas is doing, or people like Lukas and doing the work he's doing, is doing just that.